Okay. Chapter 7. The Age of Miracles. Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius Tyanus, one of the most remarkable characters of history, was born 2 years before the commencement of the Christian era. He lived 100 years, witnessed the reign of a dozen Roman emperors, and during his long and brilliant career sustained the role of a philosopher, teacher, traveler, religious reformer, and worker of miracles. The most of our information concerning him is derived from the biography written in Greek by Flavius Philostratus in the year 210. It was composed at the request of the beautiful and gifted Julia Domna, wife of the Emperor Septimus Severus. As soon as Julia was made empress, she gathered around her the finest intellects and the greatest orators of the day. Among them were Dion Cassius, the historian, the eminent lawyer Paulus Papian and Ulpen, and the learned sophist and scholar Philostratus. It was under such auspices that the life of Apollonius was written. The work has attracted much attention and has been translated into various languages. In England in 1680, Charles Blount, the deist, commenced in a translation and had proceeded as far as the first two books, which he published with extensive notes when he seems to have become alarmed at the opposition of the ecclesiastics of his day and did not further prosecute the work. In his preface, Blount refers in his quaint manner to the supposed opposition of the book of Philostratus to the Christian scriptures. Philostratus does not, says he, anywhere so much as mention the name of Christ, and if one heathen writer, Heracles, did make an ill use of this history by comparing Apollonius to Christ, what is that to Philostratus? Now, as to myself, he continues, I am so far from comparing him to our beloved, our blessed Savior, or from giving credit to any new miracles, that my daily request to God is to give me faith enough to believe the old. In the year 1809, Reverend Edward Berwick, vicar of Leixlip in Ireland, translated the whole 8 books of Philostratus, the celebrated Lardner, having in the meantime given his opinion that the work was not intended to antagonize the New Testament. Let us now open the celebrated book of Philostratus and take a brief survey of its contents. He commences by giving an account of the materials from which the work was composed, stating that he obtained them from the different cities and temples from tradition and from the epistles of Apollonius, addressed to kings, sophists, and philosophers, to Hellenes, Delphines, Indians, and Egyptians. Also, that he had made use of the book of Maximus the Aegean, the biography written by Damis the Assyrian, who had accompanied Apollonius in his travels, and a work written by one Marigenes. The following is an epitome of the biography as given by Philostratus. Life of Apollonius. Apollonius was born in Tyana, a town founded by Greeks in Cappadocia. Before his birth, Proteus, the Egyptian god, appeared to his mother. She asked the god whom she should bring forth, to which he replied, Thou shalt bring forth me. Apollonius was born in a meadow under a temple since dedicated to him. When his mother was near the time of her delivery, she was warned in a dream to go and gather flowers in a meadow. When she came there, while her maidens were dispersed up and down, employed in several amusements, she fell asleep on the grass. While thus situated, a flock of swans that was feeding in the meadow formed a chorus around her, and clapping their wings, as their custom is, sang in unison while the air was fanned by a gentle zephyr. At the same time, her son was born. The natives of the place affirmed that at the instant of his birth, a thunderbolt, which seemed ready to fall upon the ground, rose aloft and suddenly disappeared. All the people of the country said he was the son of Jupiter, but he constantly called himself the son of Apollonius. As he grew up, he gave signs of great strength of memory and persevering application. The eyes of all were attracted by his beauty. His youth was spent partly in Tarsus and partly in Aegae, where he enjoyed the conversation of Plato, Chrysippus, and Aristotle. He was an enthusiastic admirer and devoted follower of Pythagoras. He declined eating anything that had life, living exclusively on fruits and other productions of the earth. His fame was spread far and near. While in his youth, he lost his parents and buried them in his native town of Tyana. He resolved never to marry. As a true disciple of Pythagoras, he maintains silence for 5 years, opposes hot baths. Wherever he goes, he reforms religious worship. His probationary term of silence having expired, he resolves to travel to India and visit the Brahmins and Germains and converse with the Magi inhabiting Babylon and Susa, saying it was his duty to go where wisdom and his guardian angel led him. While on this journey, he acquired from the Arabians a knowledge of the language of animals, an art for which others of the ancients were celebrated, Melampus, Tiresias, and Thales Melissus. Entering the territories of Babylon, he had an interview with the satrap. He continued his journey, interpreting the Damis, his companion, dreams and visions by the way. Then we have an account of Babylon with its royal mansions covered with brass and the apartments and porticos adorned with silver and with tapestry of gold and with beaten gold. Apollonius enters the king's palace, conversing with Damis and not noticing at all the splendid things surrounding him. He was received with honor by the king Bardanes, who invited him to join in the sacrifice he was then preparing of a white horse of the Nicean plains, to be offered to the sun, adorned as if in a solemn procession. Apollonius declined, but sacrificed to the sun with frankincense and then retired, lest he should be made a partaker in the shedding of blood. He visits India and is well received by Pharaohs, the king. He is offered money by both these kings, but refuses to receive it. We must not omit to mention that while on this journey to India, Damis, the companion of Apollonius, saw on Mount Caucasus the very chains with which Prometheus had been bound. They arrive at the wonderful hill occupied by the Brahmins. The sages communicate freely with Apollonius, who participates in their ablutions and ceremonies. Philostratus relates that when, with staves uplifted, the Brahmins struck the earth altogether, they made it heave and swell like waves of the sea, and they themselves were elevated to the height of almost 2 cubits above it. There they would dance while in chorus and then descend together. Arcus, the chief of the Brahmins, declares that Apollonius was, in a previous life, a pilot of the Egyptian vessel. Apollonius admits it to be true and gives some account of his life as a pilot. Then comes a feast given by the king of Brahmins. 4 Pythian tripods, like those described in Homer, came forward of their own accord. Then advanced cupbearers of black brass, like the Ganymedes and Pelops of the Greeks. The earth stewed under them herbs softer than beds, bread and fruits and the vegetables of the season, together with the dainties used at second courses, came of themselves, each in order, better dressed than they could be by our cooks. The cupbearers of brass mixed the wine and the water for the company, which they presented in small cups to every guest. Arcus cures the lame and the blind and performs many other miracles. Apollonius returns home by going south to the sea, thence by vessel up to the Euphrates to Babylon, thence by way of Antioch to Cyprus and Paphos. He goes to Ephesus. People flock about him. Certain prophecies from the oracles of Corophon, Didyme, and Pergamos in the favor spread abroad. Ambassadors come to him from several cities. He predicts the plague and tells what is going on at a distance. The plague raging at Ephesus, ambassadors were sent to him at Smyrna, entreating him to come to their assistance. Apollonius said, I think the journey is not to be delayed. No sooner had he uttered these words than he was at Ephesus. There he put an end to the plague by having the people stone a demon, which took various forms. He travels through Greece. At Athens, casts out an evil spirit from a youth. As soon as Apollonius fixed his eye upon him, the demon broke out into the most angry and horrid expressions, and then swore he would depart out of the youth. Apollonius rebuked him, commanded him to come out, and told him to give a visible sign. Immediately the demon cried out, "I will make that statue tremble," to which he pointed, standing in a royal portico. Whereupon the statue first began to shake, then totter, and finally tumbled down. Apollonius visits the temples of Greece and reforms their religious rites and ceremonies. At Corinth, Menippus, one of his disciples, a young Lycian, was in love with a beautiful and intelligent woman whom he was soon to marry. Apollonius goes as a guest to the wedding. When everything is ready, Apollonius announces that the woman is one of the Empussae, who pass under the name of Lami or larvae. Upon this announcement, everything vanished into thin air, the gold and silver vessels, cupbearers and cooks, and the whole domestic apparatus. Whereupon the phantom, appearing as if in tears, begged not to be tormented nor forced to make a confession. But Apollonius was peremptory, and she confessed to being an empussa, and that she had pampered Menippus with rich dainties for the express purpose of devouring him. Philostratus says, "I have been necessarily induced to mention this transaction, as it was one of the most celebrated performances by Apollonius, and as it happened in the center of Greece, many were acquainted with it." Having traveled all over Greece, he next went to Rome. As Nero was persecuting philosophers, his companions became frightened and nearly all left him. At Rome, he was accused of treason. The accuser came forward, beholding in his hand a roll on which had been written the accusation. When the roll was unfolded, lo and behold, neither letter nor character was to be seen. A girl, when about to be married, seemingly died, says the biographer, and the funeral procession was on its way to bury her. She was of a consular family, and all Rome condoled with the young husband. Apollonius, meeting the procession, said to the attendants, "Set down the bier, and I will dry up the tears which you are shedding for the maid." He touched the young woman, and uttering a few words over her in a low tone of voice, he wakened her from that death with which she seemed to be overcome. The relatives of the girl presented him with 150,000 drachmas, which he settled upon the bribe as a marriage portion. "It is difficult to me," said Philostratus, "as it was to all who were present, to ascertain whether Apollonius discovered the vital spark which had escaped the faculty, for it was raining at the time, which caused a vapor to rise from her face, or whether he cherished and brought back her soul, which to all appearances was extinct. Apollonius visits Spain and Africa, and thence returns to Italy and Sicily. At Syracuse, he makes a prediction concerning the 3 emperors which Rome was soon to have, which was fully verified in Galba, Vetulus, and Otho. He again travels through Greece, leaving one vessel and taking another. The one he leaves is shipwrecked. He goes to Egypt. Arriving at Alexandria, he declares a convicted man innocent. A further examination proves him to be so, and his life is saved. At Alexandria, he has an interview with Vespasian, who, on his way to Rome from Judea, where he had been carrying on the Jewish war, goes to Egypt on purpose to visit Apollonius. While Apollonius was in this part of Egypt, a tame lion, coming up to him and paying him special attention, Apollonius stated to the people that the lion wanted him to tell them by what human soul he was inhabited. He tells them it is the soul of Amasis, who was formerly king of Egypt in the district of Sais. The moment the lion heard this, he roared in a piteous strain, crouching on his knees and at the same time bursting into tears. The lion was then dressed in collars and garlands and sent into the interior parts of Egypt, accompanied all the way with the sound of flutes and the singing of hymns. Journeying into the interior of Ethiopia, Apollonius visits the gymnosophists to show they could perform wonders, as well as the Brahmins. Thespians, their leader, said to an elm tree near the one under which they were sitting, "Salute Apollonius, O tree." No sooner were the words uttered than the tree saluted him, speaking in a voice which was articulate and resembled that of a woman. Titus, having been declared emperor of Rome, requested Apollonius to meet him at Argos. On his arrival, Titus embraced him and said he had a letter from his father, Vespasian, wherein he said he considered that Apollonius was his benefactor to whom they were under many obligations. Apollonius again traveled through Greece and Italy. In the Hellespont, he drove out the wandering Egyptians and Chaldeans who, for their own gain, operating on the fears of the people who were dreading earthquakes, were collecting money on pretense of making costly sacrifices. He now took up his residence at the grove of Smyrna on the banks of the Meles, where he discoursed of fate and necessity. Knowing that Nerva was to succeed Domitian, he spoke of it as a matter of public notoriety and showed that tyrants themselves were unable to resist the decrees of fate. Some of his expressions having been repeated by Domination, Domination, I think is his name, Apollonius was cited to appear before him. Before receiving the summons, however, he was apprised of it by his guardian spirit and started at once for Italy. Arriving at Rome, he is brought before the emperor and is accursed with great violence of being an enchanter, is taken to prison, discourses encouragingly to his fellow prisoners. Being brought before the emperor, he talks with so much boldness that Domitian orders his hair and beard to be cut off and that he be sent back to prison. Loaded with chains and being cast among the vilest felons, he was now nearly 100 years old. Damis, who was also in prison, asked him when he would be at liberty. Tomorrow, answered Apollonius, if it depends on the judge, this instant, if it depends on myself. Saying this, he drew his leg out of the fetters and said to Damis, you see the liberty I enjoy. He then put his leg in the fetters again. He goes to the tribunal to make his defense. Domitian perused the indictment, sometimes in great wrath, sometimes with more composure. I think, says Philostratus, we may represent Domitian to our minds as a man highly incensed at the laws forever having suffered such things as tribunals to be constructed. Apollonius was required to enter the tribunal free from amulet, book of or charm, or any writing whatever. As he went into the room, he did not once look at the emperor. He was commanded to look at Domitian as the god of men. Apollonius lifted his eyes to the vaulted arch of the court, and by his gesture showed that they were turned to Jupiter. The water was then measured into the clepsydra, the dropping from which was to measure the time of his defense. There were 4 articles of accusation. Hold on. The accuser thus began, what is the reason, Apollonius, you do not wear the same kind of garments as other men? Because, he replied, the earth which supplies me with food supplies me also with raiment, and by wearing garments derived from it, I offer no injury to miserable animals. 2. Why do men call you God? Because, he said, every man that is good is entitled to the appellation. 3. How could you foretell the plague at Ephesus? Answer, by living on a lighter diet than any other men. 4. Tell me, Apollonius, said the accuser, on whose account you sacrificed a boy on the day you left your house and went into the country. If it can be proved, replied Apollonius, that I left my house on the day alluded to, I will grant my being in the country and offering the sacrifice in question. But it shall require persons of both credit and character to substantiate the fact. Thereupon a shout of applause arose from the spectators, and Domitian himself, being affected by the strength and ingenuity of his answer, said, I acquit you of the crimes laid to your charge, but here you shall stay until I have had some private conversation with you. Apollonius replied, you can detain my body, but not my soul, and I will add not even my body, for as Homer says, not even thy deadly spear can slay me, because I am not mortal. While uttering these words, he vanished from the tribunal. Damis had gone to Puteoli, where he and Demetrius, the philosopher, a friend of Apollonius, were on that day, musing and walking together on the seashore, celebrated by the story of Calispio. Calypso. They had little or no hope of ever seeing Apollonius again. Tired with their walk, they sat down in a nymphanium, a building adorned with statues of nymphs, wherein was a cistern of white marble containing a living spring of water, which never rose above and was never drawn below its margin. They were talking listlessly while sorrow filled their hearts when suddenly Apollonius appeared before them. It was on the same day of the trial, though Puteoli was more than 3 days' journey from Rome. Demetrius wished to know if he was alive. Apollonius stretched out his hand and commanded him to take it to assure him that he was still living. He returned to Greece and traveled through all the cities, teaching the crowds who flocked to see him. While Domitian was being assassinated at Rome by Stephanus, Apollonius was walking and talking, disputing among the trees in one of the existias of Ephesus. It was about midday. Suddenly, Apollonius let his voice fall as if alarmed at something. He then went on conversing in a lower tone, then became quite silent. Soon, after fixing his eyes steadfastly on the earth and advancing 3 or 4 steps, he cried out, "Strike the tyrant, strike," as if actually witnessing some occurrence. All Ephesus was astonished at what was heard, there being a large concourse present. But Apollonius, after stopping some time, cried out, "Keep up your spirits, O Ephesians, for this day the tyrant is killed." And why do I say this day? At this very moment, while the words are in my mouth, I swear it by Minerva, the deed is done. Then he remained silent. This is the account of Philostratus. The same transaction is related by Dion Cassius with such variation of details as is supposed to strengthen statements of that kind. That author's account is as follows. All right, we'll keep going. On the very day, nay, the moment Domitian was assassinated, as it was afterward known upon the most exact search into the matter, Apollonius Tyanus got up, whether it was in the city of Ephesus or elsewhere, upon a very high stone, and calling the people together, cried out with a loud voice, "Courage, Stephanus, courage, strike the murderer. Thou hast struck him, thou hast wounded him, thou hast killed him." As incredible as the fact seems to be, says the historian, it is no less true. This testimony of Dion Cassius is more important from the fact that he was no admirer of Apollonius, but in another part of his history puts him down as an impostor and a magician. He complains of Caracalla that he was such a favorer of impostors and magicians that he paid great honors to the memory of Apollonius of Cappadocia and raised a monument to him. Baronius supposes the assassination of Domitian to have been communicated to Apollonius by a demon. The time was now approaching which was to terminate the career of this remarkable man. Nerva, having sent a letter to the philosopher requesting him to come to Rome and give him advice, Apollonius replied as follows. "We will converse together, O Emperor, during a long time, where we will neither command others nor will others command us." This letter was afterward construed to mean that Apollonius was about to leave this world and that Nerva's reign was to be short. Here, says Philostratus, ends the history of Apollonius of Tyana, as written by Damis the Assyrian. Concerning the manner of his death, he continues, "If he did die, various are the accounts. Some say he died at Ephesus, waited on by 2 handmaids, to one of whom he gave her freedom, foreseeing it would be better for the other to remain where she was. Some say he entered the temple of Minerva at Lindus and there disappeared. Others affirm that his exit was made at Crete in a still more extraordinary way. The temple of Dictyma at Crete was under the protection of dogs who took care of the riches laid up in it. When Apollonius entered the temple, the dogs did not bark at him as they did at others, but received him with favor, with fawning affection. The priests who had the care of the temple, seeing this, seized Apollonius and bound him, thinking him a magician or a robber. About midnight, he freed himself from his chains and called the priests to show that he did nothing in secret. Then, going to the gates of the temple, he found them open. As soon as he entered them, they shut themselves as they had been before, and the temples resounded with the singing of many virgins, the burden of whose song was, "Leave the earth, come to heaven, come, come." After his death, he appeared at Tyana to a young man who had doubted the immortality of the soul and discoursed with him upon the subject. The young man cried out, "I believe you now." He had often requested Apollonius to appear to him, and he finally did so. Here ends the history of Philostratus. Suidas and Eudocia inform us that a life of Apollonius was written also by one Sotericus Ocytes. For several centuries after his death, Apollonius was worshipped as a god in many parts of the world. Not only did Caracalla build him a temple, but Alexander Severus held him in such esteem that he had his statue in his private closet. On account of Apollonius, Tyana was held sacred and exempted from the jurisdiction of governors sent from Rome. Roman emperors have not refused him the same honors as were paid to themselves, and Gibbon relates that when Aurelian took the town of Tyana, a superstitious reverence induced him to treat with lenity the court countrymen of Apollonius the philosopher. M. Bale remarks that Apollonius was worshipped in the beginning of the 4th century under the name of Hercules, and refers to Vopiscus, Eusebius, and Marcellinus to show that the people of Tyana had not left off the worship of Apollonius in the beginning of the 4th century. His image was set up in many temples. Roman emperors encouraged it. Lampridius states that Christ was really worshipped by some of the later heathen emperors, together with Abraham, Orpheus, and Apollonius, these being all looked upon as holy men and tutelary genii. Albert Ravelli says the universal respect in which he was held by the whole pagan world testified to the deep impression which the life of this supernatural being had left indelibly fixed in their minds, an impression which caused one of his contemporaries to exclaim, "We have a God living among us, pagan Christ," etc., by Albert Ravel, London, 1866, page 39. Eunuppus, who wrote at the beginning of the 5th century, says of him that he was not so much of a philosopher as something between a god and a man, and that Philostratus ought to have entitled his story the descent of a god upon earth. Sidonius Apollinaris, AD 475, praises the morals and philosophy of Apollonius without speaking of his miracles. In the 8th book, 3rd epistle to Leon, counselor to the king of Goths, he delivers a glowing eulogium upon Apollonius. He speaks of his disdain for riches and his ostentatious display, of his love for science, his frugality, his gravity, sincerity, and uprightness of character, his abstinence from animal food, etc., and closes as follows. In one word, to say the truth, I do not know as there is in all antiquity the life of a philosopher equal to this one, and I am very certain that such a one cannot be found in this age. Notwithstanding all this evidence of the high esteem in which he was held by the ancients, the historian Froude, on the strength of a sentence or two of Lucian in a letter to Celsus, would place him on a level with the impostor, Alexander Abonoticus of the 2nd century. Alexander Abonoticus. That such a classification would do great injustice to Apollonius and manifest from his epistles, which are still extant. They are addressed to individuals, to societies, to philosophers, to kings and emperors. These writings show him to have been a man of learning, with a consummate knowledge of human nature, imbued with the noblest sentiments and with the principles of a profound philosophy. In his letter to Hestius, he says, The truth is not concealed from us how beautiful it is to have all the earth for one's country and all men for brothers and friends, and that those who derive their origin from God are all endowed with one and the same nature and with a community of reason and affections, and that whatsoever any one may be or in whatever manner born, whether barbarian or Greek, he is still a man. But the claims of kindred cannot be evaded, and one recalls to himself whatever is properly his own. Thus, the Ulysses of Homer, as they say, did not prefer immortality even when offered by the goddess. In the Epistle of Valerius, we have the doctrine of the indestructibility of matter. There is no death of anything except in appearance, and so also passes over from essence into nature seems to be birth, and what passes over from nature into essence seems in like manner to be death. Though nothing really is originated and nothing ever perishes, but only now comes into sight and now vanishes. It appears by reason of the density of matter and disappears by reason of the tenuity of essence, but is always the same, differing only in motion and condition. In the next paragraph, enlarging upon the same idea, he closes by saying, "No thing is ever created or destroyed." Again, by what other name than first essence shall this rightly be called? These things are done and permitted by the eternal God, who becomes all in all and through all, and who, if he were to clothe himself in the name and forms, would suffer loss and damage in his own nature. To a brother who had lost his wife, he writes, "It is destined that whatever has come to perfection must pass away. Let not therefore the loss of your wife in the ripeness of age shock you, and not because something is called death, consider life better than it, since life is considered inferior by every wise person. If there had been anything to be reprehended in your late wife, you might reasonably be cast down. But she was always esteemed by us, was always loving to her husband, and everything to be desired." He closes the letter with these affecting words: "For tears I not been able to write more, and more than this I have not thought necessary." As to the miracles ascribed by Apollonius, the most of them were probably the invention of the 2nd century. There is little doubt, however, that he possessed some extraordinary faculty, which he exercised in such a way as to establish and maintain the influence over his fellow men, beyond what he could otherwise attain. Perhaps the highest tribute paid to Apollonius was by the Emperor Titus, the philosopher, having written him soon after his accession, counseling moderation in his government. Titus replied as follows: "In my own name, and in the name of my country, I give you thanks, and will be mindful of those things. I have indeed taken Jerusalem, but you have captured me." The miracles of Apollonius were extensively believed in the 2nd century and for hundreds of years afterwards, and by Christians as well as others. As late as the 4th century, when Heracles had drawn a parallel between Apollonius and Christ, Eusebius, who thought it necessary to make an elaborate reply, did not deny the performance of miracles by Apollonius, but attributed them to sorcery. Tilmont thought he had the assistance of Satan. "The devil," said he, "may know the history of past ages, etc., and he may know what men are doing in very distant places, and what he knew he might discover of Apollonius." Revile is of the opinion that Apollonius practiced what this writer calls thurigy, a sort of compromise between impostor and the display of miraculous power. The difficulty in placing a proper estimate upon such a character at this distance of time is great, but it may safely be asserted that Apollonius was a man possessed of many elements of greatness, that he was a man of much learning and great ability, and whatever may have been his weaknesses, he was endowed with a certain grandeur of soul which at once commands our respect and admiration.